Should I just hold up the book
Oh, yes, please.
as
Great.
a screen grab there?
I have mine too.
Darn, we don't have a copy within reach, but anyway,
That's
you've got it
okay.
covered.
Well, thank you again for joining us today. My name is Hannah Harris with the Sun Valley Institute for Resilience. We work to transform the regional food system in South Central Idaho. We are thrilled today to be hosting co-authors David Montgomery and Anne Biklé. Together, they've written multiple books, all of which relate to the significance and complexities of soil health. I will send out, oh, we've got another participant here. I will send out a follow-up email with their website information. And if you're watching this later on YouTube, their website will be linked below. David Montgomery is a professor at the University of Washington, a MacArthur Fellow, and an internationally recognized expert on geomorphology, which was a word that was new to me until I found your work. Anne Biklé is a biologist and environmental planner whose writing has appeared in Nautilus, Natural History, and Smithsonian. There will be time for audience questions at the end, so if you think of any as we go, please write them down or write them in the chat. So without further ado, we'll be discussing your most recent book, What Your Food Ate. And the subtitle is How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. So this book, for folks who have not yet read it, is divided into 4 main sections: soil, plant, animal, and people. And in each section, you walk us through different historic, oh, Brooke's got hers, amazing. In each section, you walk us through historic and recent studies on the relationship between soil health and food quality, and then also food quality and our health, the health of animals, plants, and people. So to start, could you please tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this specific book together, and how it differs from your previous work and the new ideas or research that it brings together?
Go ahead.
Um, we started looking into the soil health a number of years ago and a number of books ago, and looked at the connections of how people treat the land affects the course and fate of human societies, how microbial life is really sort of the root of fertility, and how regenerative farming practices can rebuild soil fertility. And after sort of diving into those sort of angles of the world of soil health, we wanted to look at the potential connection to what does soil health really mean for human health. And connecting the dots between soil health and human health is not straightforward. There's a lot of things between the soil and our bodies. And not the least of which is all the myriad things that actually influence our health, from our genetics, our lifestyle, our diet, what we eat, but also, and what we wanted to explore in What Your Food Ate, is the impact of how we grow our food on human health. And so in the book we trace connections between how farmers treat the land, how that affects soil health, crop health, livestock health, and ultimately human health. So it's really sort of the culmination of a series of intellectual breadcrumbs that Anne and I have been following for a while, in learning about and educating ourselves about the connections all along the way. And we didn't really just want to stop at looking at how regenerative farming can rebuild the health and fertility of the land, which we've looked at in previous books. But we want to take that one step further, look at, well, what does it really mean for us? And a lot of the discussions today around our reforming our food system center on what we eat. And we wanted to ask the question of, well, how important is it? Well, what our food actually ate. Take that question one step back in that chain, and look at all the individual connections that you need to add up to try and look at that question of, to what degree does soil health impact human health? And um, the subject of it spans both Anne and my expertise, so working on it together was kind of a fairly obvious thing to do.
Yeah. And I think some people think, that we planned this whole thing out beginning with Dave's Dave's book that was like over a decade ago, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. And I think what's particularly interesting to me is that we did not plan all of this out. It's kind of, truly like one thing led to another, to another, and to another. And I don't know how we couldn't have ended up where we did, and by that I mean with What Your Food Ate being the latest book, because Dirt pretty much showed us sort of the wreckage of agriculture, both historically and in modern times, sort of the wreckage that is sort of put onto soil because of particular practices. And then in The Hidden Half of Nature, that was the book we collaborated on prior to this one. That was really eye-opening. That was about, oh, we think we see a cure here. We think we see a cure for what is troubling the soil and troubling agriculture. And then Dave's book, Growing a Revolution, there's some farmers who are on to this, which was very, very heartening and really makes you optimistic. And then you roll all that together because indeed, how we farm, how we raise our crops and our animals, that ripples right through to the human body. So that was sort of how all the books just kind of stepped their way along, and here we are.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned actually David's first book, Dirt, that relates to this. And that leads us into our first kind of content question, which is that, in resilient agriculture, we use the word resilient, climate resilient a lot in our work. So in resilient agriculture, there are so many different labels and kind of an increasing number of these buzzwords that stakeholders can use to describe different practices that are happening on their farm. And sometimes it's, greenwashing to get folks to buy their products. But could you please describe the connection between some of these practices and the health of the rhizosphere, which was another new word for me, which is the ecosystem around the plant root. So for example, how like a no-till approach might benefit the microbiome and the bacteria and fungi in the soil.
Yeah, maybe what I'll do just for your listeners, and then I'll hand it off to David. The rhizosphere is just one of my favorite topics, and
I wouldn't stop her from talking about it.
And what we know from newer science about microbiomes in general, whether they're those, so microbiomes to begin with, these are the communities of microbes that are associated with their host. And the host can be a single plant, like a crop, some kind of crop, or trees, or animals have a microbiome. We have a microbiome. You pretty much need to be living under a rock in the last 5 to 10 years to not have heard that word and have some kind of more or less basic understanding of it. But the heart of the crop microbiome is around its root system. And this is kind of, this is a little bit different than maybe what most people might think. Because most of us think, oh, the part of the plant that's above ground, that must be really important. We know these leaves are photosynthesizing, and we know a lot of our edible foods come from above ground parts, but most of the microbiome associates with the plant's roots. And in fact, these are some of the oldest symbiotic relationships that we know about in the history of life. And so when I say symbiotic, what I mean is that the way I use this term is that there's mutual benefits going back and forth between these communities of microbes and their host. And this turns out to be sort of the key to the good life if you're a plant, because there you are, stuck in place. All you've got is your rhizosphere, this narrow zone all around the root system, and all of your partners, your microbial partners, which are doing, as we seem to learn more and more every day, these microbial partners are doing immensely important things for their crop hosts. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to Dave. And what we have been learning about the crop microbiome is that if you think about coevolution, most people think about pollinators in plants, but those between the microbes around the roots and a crop, they are millions of years older than these co-evolved relationships between pollinators and flowering plants. So this tells us it's fundamental. And part of the, maybe in large part, I guess I would really say, the problem with too much of modern agriculture is that it's disturbing and interrupting the multitude of communication routes, pathways by which microbes are communicating with their host. And so the communication and the relationship is getting all scuttled. And one thing we know about these, root symbionts is when the relationship gets scuttled, they kind of fall off the job. They go off looking for something, some other place to get their food, or they die off altogether. And so fertilizers and the whole slew of pesticides that make it into the soil are very disruptive for the symbionts. And so kind of with that background, maybe you can tell us, Dave, a little bit more about like what's going on, what do we know there?
Yeah, so we know that if you're looking at those relationships between soil life and plants, the process of tillage interrupts it, particularly if you have fungal partnerships with plants, because it breaks the fungi apart. And we also know that nitrogen fertilizers reshape the microbiome around plant roots. They disrupt the community composition. They don't necessarily, they don't sterilize the soil or necessarily reduce the amount of life in the soil, but they change who's there. They change the community composition in ways that don't favor those symbiotic relationships with crops. So if we were to basically think about what kind of agricultural practices would foster or cultivate the beneficial life in the soil, what you would want to do is think ecologically in terms of what does any ecosystem or what does any sort of set of species need in an ecosystem. They need sort of food, shelter, and a community to work in. And when you look at how we've basically managed our agricultural soils in the modern world, modern conventional agriculture, we've disrupted those relationships with intensive tillage that disrupts their habitat, with agrochemical use, which disrupts their community structure and also degrades organic matter, which is their food source. And we have favored growing sort of one or two crops in the field, sort of functional monocultures, not having, and different plants will recruit different microbes to the rhizosphere around the roots. And so if you're continually growing the same thing in the same field over and over, you have a depauperate community of life in the soil. And so what are the kind of things that would actually build soil health and a healthy community of organisms that would then support crop health and the transferal of mineral elements from the soil and the production of vitamins and things that make our food more healthful? It would be to minimize disturbance of the soil, and that minimize both physically and chemically. And that means not plowing very much, if at all, and using the minimal amount of agrochemicals as one might need as a farmer. So minimizing chemical and physical disturbance, maximizing the amount of time that living roots are in the soil, so to be growing cover crops in between crops in a commercial rotation, and also growing more than just a couple crops in a field. So rotating through 4, 5, 6 or more crops in commercial applications. And that's the combination that I wrote about in Growing Revolution and that we revisited in What Your Food Ate in terms of the science behind it. There's lots of science on how each of those individual things helps benefit communities of beneficial life in the soil, but it's that combination of all three, minimizing disturbance, cover crops, and growing a diversity of crops, that really works to cultivate the relationships, cultivate soil health and the relationships that then engenders in terms of plant life. It's just roughly the opposite of how we've taught people to farm for the last 100 years. And you may notice that cover crops and diverse rotations are not new ideas. Those are ideas that are rooted in traditional practices that were adopted by indigenous farmers around the world and traditional societies because they helped to sustain the fertility of the soil. But it's the disturbance that really did in societies in the past, particularly through tillage, that can degrade soil health over time. And so when we think about what's the kind of agriculture that would build soil health and also then build nutrient-dense foods that promote human health, as we go into in What Your Food Ate, it's that minimize disturbance, grow cover crops, and diversity. That's sort of the winning combination. One can also reintegrate animal husbandry into cropping operations to accelerate the process of soil building. So when we look at sort of the integration of animals into agriculture, it can either degrade soil health the way that, say, overgrazing has in many places in the past, or it can build soil health the way it can on regenerative ranches and regenerative farms that have used livestock to accelerate the building of soil health and fertility. And we go into all that in the book into some detail, but that's the basic general scheme of things.
Thank you. I watched one of your previous presentations from, I'm not going to remember exactly when, but you brought up this really striking photograph on the screen of a fence and then a kind of parallel section of soil that had been eroded about 5 feet because of tillage. And that was very striking to me.
Yeah, you can go to places, there's a number of places you can go to across the US where you can see that sort of fence line cliffs, where if you have areas that have not really been tilled or plowed historically next to farms that have actively been plowed, there'll often be a little bit of a cliff there. And that particular photograph you were referencing is from eastern Washington in the Palouse region, where those kind of features are common. And you can really see this step across from an unplowed field down into a plowed one that really documents roughly 5 feet of soil loss in about 50 years. That's almost an inch a year. That's incredibly fast soil erosion, which is why I like to use that photograph. But it's also not unique. There's one of my graduate students who's now at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Isaac Larson, did a study with his graduate students across the Corn Belt of the American Midwest, where they went and used pioneer cemeteries and other areas, sort of areas of native vegetation that had never been plowed, and then surveyed across from them into the neighboring fields and tried to document what's the average rate of lowering on fields that have been farmed using modern methods over the last century or so. And they found that the average rate of soil loss is roughly 1 millimeter or 2 a year, which is kind of slow until you think about it adding up over 100 years, in which case you lose, a good foot or two of soil in that time. And in many places, there's only a good foot or two of healthy, fertile topsoil there in the first place. So one of the insidious things about soil loss and degradation is that it happens at a pace that's pretty slow year to year. But if it keeps happening, it adds up. And we're looking at the state today where we're still losing soil off of our agricultural lands globally at roughly that global pace of roughly 1 millimeter a year. I did a study of that 15 years ago or so, and that was peer reviewed and published. It seems that's sort of the rate at which things are going. And when you compare that to the rate at which nature builds soil, it takes nature, centuries to rebuild the soil that we're currently losing in decades. That mismatch is a big problem. And that's why we sort of got motivated to look at regenerative farming. And the way we use the term regenerative, although there's lots of arguments over what it really means as a term, but the way we use it is in the farming context is farming that actually can sustain or build soil health, so that you're not losing the soil, you're not losing soil organic matter, you're not degrading the microbial community composition. And there's a lot of ways to do that kind of span the whole sort of conventional to organic spectrum of farming practices. But the idea is that if you're promoting soil health, you're basically working in a regenerative agriculture situation.
Great, thank you. And so our next question is something that Anne spoke to a little bit with our last question, but kind of moving up the roots, so to speak. Why are the ecosystems within rhizospheres so vital to nutrient density and availability in our plant food? So why does the microbiome make such a big difference when it comes to the nutrients that the actual plant is absorbing?
Yeah, that kind of goes almost directly to the fact that plants are stuck in place and their roots only go so far. And so, long before, there were farmers and agriculture, plants developed these partnerships and relationships with things living in the soil. And the way it would work is plants have a monopoly, of course, on sunshine, monopoly, so to speak, meaning that there's an abundance, there's an infinite amount of sun out there. Plants can photosynthesize and turn that sunlight into energy. And estimates vary, but anywhere from like 5% to 40% of the energy that crops and all plants pull, through into their bodies through photosynthesis, it's used to make food for all of these partners down in the soil. And it's called, these various compounds and chemicals are called exudates. And so plants, they're also just marvelous, bits of chemistry. I don't really like to use the word factory, but let's just say, they can gin up just about anything. And what they're doing is they're making these mixes of exudates, they're pushing them down into their roots and then releasing them through their roots into the rhizosphere. And these exudates are a huge food source for their microbial partners. And the microbes, fungi, bacteria, protists, archaea, rely heavily on these exudates. But plants are also not stupid, and they'll only make and release these exudates so long as they get nutrients back from their partners. So one of the most important and one of the best researched nutrients that is known about in this context is that mycorrhizal fungi can acquire phosphorus for crops. And for those who may not know it, when you hear NPK or you see that on the front of a fertilizer bag, that middle letter there, P, stands for phosphorus. And these three chemicals, nitrogen, phosphorus, and K is for potassium, they're absolutely essential to plant growth. You get deficiencies in any one of those, and plant growth is stunted, and other things occur that are negative. So phosphorus is hugely important for plant growth, and mycorrhizal fungi are instrumental in getting that for plants. In fact, there's been a number of studies that have shown that phosphorus uptake by crops with robust mycorrhizal fungi populations increases from 10 to 20 to 30% or more when they have robust mycorrhizal fungal populations that are out there mining and foraging and transporting all of this phosphorus back. And another sort of very new area that relates to nutrient density is there's microbial metabolites. So these are compounds that, microbes are their own sort of chemistry miracles as well. And there's an amino acid called ergothioneine that we know that soil microbes make. Fungi and bacteria, it appears, and ergothioneine can then enter into plants, into our crops, and then it becomes a part of what we eat. And what's known about ergothioneine is it's one of these compounds that is really sort of a fix-it and a cellular maintainer. And this is really what we want, especially, throughout the human lifespan. Because once somebody's done growing, they've got all this biomass and it needs to be taken care of. So ergothioneine is one of those compounds that helps do that. And then of course there's the big category of phytochemicals. And they are something, again, unique to plants, but plants rely on their microbial populations often to stimulate production of phytochemicals. And phytochemicals, crops use them for defense, for communication. Those are two really important aspects. And so they need their microbiome to help them make, the right phytochemicals and in the right mixes. And so phytochemicals are things that, like beta carotene is a phytochemical. All these blues and purple hues and berries, those are anthocyanins. And without microbiomes, phytochemical production comes down, and that's bad for the plant because it's a big part of their defense system. And in our own bodies, these phytochemicals serve a number of roles that are essential to our cells, tissues, and organs. And so if levels of phytochemicals are low in our crops and as well as in our animal foods, that just means our own bodies are not getting that. And phytochemicals serve a slew of different functions, all of which are positive, ranging from normalizing immunity, normalizing metabolism, they're brain protective, they're cardiovascular protective. They're very, very helpful. And we really want our plant and animal foods, suffused with as high a levels as possible of these compounds. And the whole problem is that if microbial populations in the soil get disrupted and disturbed and are decreased, we don't get as many of these positive, compounds and chemicals ending up in the human food supply.
David, anything to add to that question?
No, that was a good one.
Yeah, thank you. And Anne, you actually spoke to the next question that I had, which is the importance of phytochemicals. And that's a consistent thread throughout the book to, plants themselves, but also to human health. So thank you for speaking to that. And kind of an unplanned question, but to bring this in because you spoke to the phytochemicals, another thread that I thought was really interesting throughout the book was the detrimental effects of nitrogen runoff and how that can impact human health. So would you mind speaking to that a little bit and how, that this excess of nitrogen seeping into our ecosystems can cause negative effects?
Well, one of the basic aspects of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers is that they're soluble, and that's by design, right? Because if you're applying them to a field, you want the crop to take it up through its roots. So you want the fertilizer to dissolve in water so the plant can pull it up. But what that also means is that if it rains, that rainwater is going to pick up that fertilizer or a good portion of it and move it to wherever the water goes. And that can be not only into crops, but also into groundwater and into rivers and streams. And so there's a lot of nitrate pollution from agricultural runoff in both water supplies and in rivers and streams that affect ecosystems. And phosphorus also applied excessively will run off as well, and that causes downstream problems in lakes and things like the Gulf of Mexico. We get, nitrogen as an element is a nutrient in the sense that we need it. It's a building block of proteins, but we get enough nitrogen in our diets in the Western world. We get plenty of protein, we get plenty of nitrogen, and we don't need a whole lot more, particularly in oxidized forms that can impact our health when they get into us as well. So it's sort of the runoff from agricultural fields that can end up in us, that can end up having downstream adverse health effects in human populations as well. In a different mechanism than, say, pesticides, which act in different ways, but are also coming off of farm fields and impacting human health as well.
Yeah, and I think, we talk a lot about carbon and the carbon cycle and the imbalance that we're currently experiencing. And I think maybe not everybody realizes that there's also the nitrogen cycle. And what has been happening, since after World War II, when we began making huge amounts of nitrogen synthetically and turning it into fertilizers, it's created this big imbalance. And some of the things that Dave talked about, we've got this big imbalance. We've got way too much nitrogen sitting there in the soil and sitting there in water bodies. And so it's fueling excessive growth of algae and other kinds of plants, for example, down in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, the problem is not so much that there's too much nitrogen in the soil at all times, but we're adding so much that it spills off in the runoff and goes other places where it's not doing the thing that was intended, which is to helping to grow crops.
Right. The other thing about sort of excessive nitrogen applications onto the soil is that it's one of the biggest sort of disruptive factors in the symbiotic relationship between crops and their symbionts, because as soon as crops are getting, like, this nitrogen fertilizer to a crop is free. They're not doing anything to really earn that nitrogen, so to speak, because it's sitting there in a soluble form in such high quantities that it causes plants to cut back on their exudate production. And when they do that, then it kind of leaves the microbiome high and dry. And that means that plants are really losing their whole defensive force when microbiomes are starved of exudate. So that there's this sort of indirect way in which excessive nitrogen in soils affects the microbiome, and it creates other problems for crops. And another one of which is nitrogen's often over applied, in part because it's, until pretty recently, it was not all that expensive. And we all often have done things like, well, if a little bit is good, a whole lot more must be even better. So that's how you get excessive nitrogen applications. And there's so much nitrogen for a plant, it's almost like you've set a person in front of an endless buffet of food, and all they do is sit there and eat and eat and eat. And that's actually very demanding metabolically and energetically. And so the other problem is that even if crops, say we're going to allocate energy to making exudates, it's almost all been swamped by the energetic demands of assimilating all of this nitrogen into bigger leaves, bigger fruits, bigger whatever part of the crop. And so it turns into this big metabolic imbalance, and growth is an important thing for an organism. And here a crop is sitting there with all of this free nitrogen, and they cut back so severely on exudates that their microbiome gets all fouled up. And then in come the pathogens. And then farmers, of course, they want to get their crops to the finish line, so in come the pesticides. So it becomes this sort of, double whammy effect of nitrogen fertilizers kind of kick off the first perturbation, and then that leads to less effective plant defensive responses, and then farmers come in with pesticides because, I'll tell you this, all the pests and pathogens out there, even though we use those terms for them, there are a lot of them, and they're also looking for a free lunch. And they're smart. They can sense and they can nibble, and they know when plants are poorly defended. And part of that goes back to your phytochemical question, because the other thing crops cut back on is phytochemicals are also energetically demanding to make. Well, crops have allocating all their energy into growth, so then the phytochemicals drop off, and then the insects are like, wow, this is great, this plant has hardly any phytochemicals, I'm going to eat. And they've got an excess amount of nitrogen, which is very important to insects as well. So they're finding a great free nitrogen source, and that's sort of the trickle down effect of excessive nitrogen.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like more folks are familiar with the issues around glyphosate. So I wanted to ask about nitrogen because I feel like not as many people are clued into that broader impact and how interconnected that cycle is. Like you mentioned, carbon cycle versus nitrogen.
And one of the really powerful things about that combination of practices we talked about earlier that form the backbone of regenerative agriculture is it enables farmers to grow comparable yields, to grow just about as much, but use far less synthetic nitrogen and far less, if any, glyphosate.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Right.
Best of both worlds. And so our next question, and I'm watching the time, we'll make time for audience questions too. But moving away a little bit from plant life, something that I was really interested in the book is this topic of body wisdom among livestock and animals. And so similarly to building healthy soil for plants, creating healthy environments for the animals we eat allows for this body wisdom to happen. So could you please explain that concept a little bit and expand upon it for folks?
And this is one you should probably do.
Yeah, sure. This is a concept for anybody who's, a rancher or who's really interested in this. There's a guy who's written a book called Nourishment. His name's Fred Provenza, and he he talks a lot about body wisdom. And what it is basically is this idea that every organism, a plant, a person, an animal, there's biology inherent to all of these organisms. And so you take a highly specialized herbivore like a cow or a goat or sheep or their wild relatives. And they're specialized herbivores in that the very upper end of their digestive tract is the heart of their microbiome. It's kind of like the equivalent of the rhizosphere for crops. So this is where all of their microbes are, and their microbes are essential for transforming all of the plants that these herbivores eat into energy, into various microbial metabolites and other compounds that then enter the tissue and the milk of these animals. And what these animals are able to do with their diet is balance their need for phytochemicals, because phytochemicals are obviously in all plants, and these are herbivores. So basically, they're eating phytochemicals day in and day out. And their body wisdom allows them to take in just the right amount, or let's put it this way, non-toxic levels of plants that are also providing their nutrient needs. And what I mean by non-toxic is, it's long been puzzling to people about how are these herbivores that are eating all of these plants filled with phytochemicals, many of which are toxic. That's the whole point of them. Plants are trying to keep insects and other pathogens, including herbivores, four-legged herbivores, away from them, right? They can't be eaten literally to death. So this phytochemical composition of plants, there's always this dance between herbivores and their phytochemical intake. And body wisdom is the ability, this biology that's inherent to ruminants, to be able to figure out, okay, I've had my fill of tannins, for example, from these particular species of plants. And my microbiome and my own ruminant biology is now, there's these feedbacks between the brain and the gut in these animals that says, time to move away from the tannins and move on to another kind of plant that has very low levels of tannins. And so this is what these animals and their body wisdom, this is what's happening when we watch animals that graze. It might look like they're kind of dumb. They're lumbering around out there in some pasture. They're not like fast and quick like carnivores. But what's happening is their body wisdom. And it's these complex feedbacks between microbiome, the animal, and the plant communities in which they're grazing. And we also know that through body wisdom, these animals can self-medicate. For example, gut parasites are a problem in ruminants. So these are worms and things like that, that they're, sorry for this, but happier than clams down there, in the gut of a ruminant, getting to feed on all of this free stuff. But they're stealing food, in a sense, from the ruminant. So a ruminant, through all these feedbacks, it can go and it can eat plants that are toxic to that parasite and get them out of their bodies. And so this is part of the self-medicating aspect of body wisdom as well. And it operates in us too. It's just a little harder in a modern environment and navigating a grocery store. But we've probably, at some point, though we maybe didn't realize it, you feel, when I feel a cold coming on, I don't know why, but I just feel like I really need some warm liquids like chicken broth, or other kinds of foods that have nutrients and compounds in them that are going to help my body heal and or fend off a virus or a bacterium or something like that. So it's a fascinating area. And we also know that the microbiome of an organism is intimately involved in these feedbacks that make for body wisdom.
Thank you. I have one more question before we get to audience questions. And I always end interviews with this question because I love to hear what experts have to say. But the last section of your book is titled Choosing Life, which parallels a phrase I picked up recently in reference to regenerative agriculture, which is life-affirming practices. So instead of all of these asides, pesticides, herbicides. So kind of based off of that premise, what is your vision for regenerative and resilient food and agricultural systems in the future? And what would you say is the biggest takeaway for folks from this book?
Boy, well, I'll do the sort of the big picture broad sweep first, in the sense that what I would like to see in terms of regenerative agriculture is a reform of what we now call conventional agriculture to be one that follows along the lines that you were getting at in terms of building soil health and building the fertility of the land, the productive capacity of the land as a consequence of intensive farming. There's been individual farmers and certain styles of farming that have done that for years and millennia in different parts of the world. But it would be a real sea change for our global agriculture to actually move towards that as an organizing principle behind our agricultural enterprise, to be building the health of the planet rather than mining it. And we're at a point in our history where we kind of need to do that now, and we kind of know how to do it in terms of these regenerative practices. The challenge is, how do we operationalize it and spread it in terms of making regenerative farming in a meaningful sense, and not the greenwashing sense that you mentioned earlier that is an issue, but making that the new style of conventional agriculture, in the sense that that's what people do as a default.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to that is that I would really like to see kind of people changing their mind and changing their awareness about soil. Because until we start caring for something and taking more of an interest in it, just urging and encouraging people to change practices only gets you so far, until, a farmer actually has either decided that they have an interest in these new practices, that they want to learn more. They're really probably not going to be adopting them. And so anything we can do to kind of, shift the minds of, and it's not just on the shoulders of farmers, it's also on the shoulders of, of eaters and policymakers. And that if we could all begin to, embrace and realize and acknowledge and do funding and research with soil health as the foundation of our health, and also be seeing agricultural policy as health policy, that then becomes, I think, a really nice launch pad for getting, more into regenerative agriculture. And as Dave was saying, what if the new conventional became a form of agriculture where, because of the methods and practices by which we grow crops and raise animals, soil health and human health becomes better? I mean, wow, I'm up for that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Great. Well, our first audience question is from Robin, and it says, how do pollinators factor into regenerative agriculture? Wondering if you think industrial use of domestic honeybees is a problem.
I think it's something, maybe about a third of the crops that people grow globally, or maybe even more, depend on pollinators for actually producing the crops. So pollinators are essential for our global agricultural enterprise. And yet we've been engaged in what some have termed an insect apocalypse, in terms of by some estimates, we've already killed off about half the insects on Earth. And that hasn't spared the pollinators. And so one of the farms that Ann and I visited when we were writing What Your Food Ate was Jonathan Lundgren's farm, Blue Dasher Farm in South Dakota, where he's an entomologist who has gone into regenerative farming, and his farm was a wonderfully diverse, rich place full of insects. I mean, there was lots of insect noise and buzz, and And many people are sort of worried that if there's lots of insects, won't that like harm crops or isn't that bad? And no, there are plenty of carnivorous insects eating the other insects and managing them. So when you think about one of the side benefits of a regenerative style of agriculture that involves minimal disturbance and minimal chemical use, minimal pesticide use, is that the pollinators benefit, and as do the insect predators that eat insect pests. And so there's a connection. That's one of the potential benefits of regenerative farming is a boost to our pollinator populations.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that question was, well, what about domestic bees? And there is a real problem with relying on one species, and it's been in the last, I want to say, at least 5 to 10 years that we've been seeing incredible stresses on these honeybees that are used, first in California, in the first few, let's just say February, March or so, and then they're marched up the West Coast, into Oregon and Washington and then across the country. And these bees get worn out, and they're also subject to all of these chemicals that are used on the various farms where they are pollinating crops. And so there's been huge die-offs of bees and their hives, and I think that should tell us in and of itself that relying on one species and exposing them to high levels of various chemicals isn't working out. And another benefit of using way fewer chemicals on farms is that we could rely more on native pollinators as well. And I'm not, there's a lot there between native pollinators and these domesticated crops, but insects aren't stupid either. And where there's a food source, in many cases they will find it. And the other thing about native pollinators is they're more likely to already be adapting to all the climate perturbation, whether it's, longer springs or shorter springs or what have you. So I think there's some things to work on in that area.
Well, and I think that the impact of modern agriculture on pollinators, which is nature's way of evolved, the way nature evolved to basically support terrestrial ecosystems and the productivity of a lot of botanical biology, that modern agriculture is taking them out. It basically points the finger at something being wrong with modern agriculture.
Yeah, I think Amy has something to add, and then we'll get to our last question from Brooke. So Amy, what's your addition here?
I have a question. Sorry, I went off video because a little one joined me and she's very distracting playing the stuff. I'm like struggling to formulate a question around this, but for me, there were so many profound parts of the book, but the one that really stuck out with me that I keep thinking on is the change of the fatty acid profiles for when ruminants are eating fresh forage versus dried forage. And I had an opportunity to be on a ranch this summer, and we were getting a little geeky and we were looking at cow pies, and somebody was like, well, what does this cow pie tell us about what they're eating? And he was saying how they actually needed more browns because they were eating so many greens that the cow pie was becoming runny, and kind of thinking of this body wisdom. And I don't know like exactly what my question is, but it's around this, like, where's the balance between eating the fresh grass to make the most nutrient dense, good for us dairy products versus the balance that the cow needs for their internal systems? And like, is it the same for what the cow needs? That's the right ratio for us, or is what's like healthiest for us maybe not healthiest for the cow? And like, are there studies around that? Do we understand that yet? Is that what needs to be explored more when we think about like, is dairy something we should be consuming? If we are consuming it, what's the quality that we're looking for? As like a local, I try to buy all organic dairy, and now I'm like, well, I better ask my dairy farmers exactly what their cows are eating so I get the highest quality dairy I can. So yeah, I don't know if there's a response you have for that, but it's just something I've been thinking a lot about since reading the book.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is sort of what I call the ruminant health plan, and it's an abundance of fresh plants, a diversity of those plants, and also a high level of fiber. Because the rumen, all these organisms in the animal's rumen, they're fiber transformers. They are able to derive their own energy off of a high fiber diet. And so it's the real problem with animals and their diet and how that ripples through to us is that when they're eating, it's too dried forages aren't so much a problem. The real problem is what happens with animals that get put into these concentrated animal feeding operations. Their diets are very high in what are called concentrates and also grains. Concentrates, you can kind of just figure that these are the ruminant, the cattle version of ultra processed foods. And so this is not fiber rich, it's not phytochemical rich, it's various other things. And grains are just not well, they can be phytochemical rich, but they're certainly not fiber rich. They really wreak havoc on the animal. And so that also imbalances the fat profile in animals when you get a lot of omega-6s, which grains are very high in. That transfers through to meat and milk, and then that introduces a lot of omega-6s into the human diet via animal foods. Another big source of omega-6s in the human diet doesn't have anything to do with animals. It has to do with all of the seed oils. So we're taking sunflower and safflower and canola, and we're taking these seeds and we're squeezing them, and we're kind of then becoming cows at a trough, eating a lot of omega-6s in these seed oils. So, if someone is choosing to eat animal foods, it's really important that it kind of goes beyond organic, because you can get meat and milk certified organic so long as the grains that those animals were fed on are organic. This is not a phytochemical, fiber-rich diet. So that's something to be aware of, and it goes the same for, our other livestock, chickens and pigs. They can be eating organic corn and soy and be certified as organic because they are eating organic foods. And it's different with pigs and chickens. They're not herbivores, but it's still something just to be aware of. And as far as, some people are lactose intolerant, so dairy's probably not for them. And they sort of thereby sort of avoid the whole omega-3/6 thing. But if they are, on the other hand, eating a bunch of seed oils, that's a whole lot of omega-6s coming into their diet. I guess there's a lot of information in the book, as you know, and that's an interesting question that you put forward, like what's the link between, if it's good for the animal, is it good for us? And I think the way Dave and I put it is kind of as simply as we can is, if it's good for the soil, and if it's good for the crop, and if it's good for, the cow, the chicken, and the pig, there's a very high likelihood that it's also good for us. It's just sort of it's one of those things that just appears to be the way it is. And we also know, when we degrade soil and when we are feeding animals diets that are not matched to their inherent biology, that ricochets, right into our health as well.
Thank you, Amy. That was actually a question I had planned on asking, but I wasn't sure if we would have time. So thank you. I'm glad that you revisited that, because the omega-3s versus 6s is something I found really interesting as well, and the ties to inflammation in human health. So our last question is from Brooke, who is a regenerative farmer locally in our valley. And she is asking about thoughts on attempts to come up with a certification for regenerative farms, and kind of this tricky dichotomy between creating hoops that farmers have to jump through and the bureaucracy around that, but also wanting to avoid greenwashing and how a certification could diminish attempts of greenwashing from these bigger companies that are using it as a superficial label?
I think part of the basic issue there is how we end up defining what regenerative farming actually is. And personally, I'm a little agnostic on certifications. I can see them as very useful tools in terms of informing consumers about people who are using better practices than others. And there's also the potential for certifications to be taken over and become an instrument of greenwashing. And the sustainable forestry is a good example of that. There's two sustainable certifications in forestry, one of which is industry backed and meaningless, and the other of which is actually quite meaningful. But to a consumer, seeing just it's certified sustainable, I think is how they do it. Or in that industry, it's hard to sort out as a consumer what you're actually supporting because of those, certification systems that have very different levels of certification or different styles of certification that go into them. Where I think we really need to focus is on the whole philosophy of farming, the big picture view of building soil health. Because if we did that, then the style of farming that some are calling regenerative, that is basically just no-till farming with a whole lot of glyphosate, that wouldn't cut it in terms of a regenerative definition where you're promoting building soil health. No-till is a good foundation for building soil health, but not if you're then using a whole lot of synthetic agrochemicals on the fields. So I tend to engage that question at sort of at the next higher level in terms of how are we thinking of the term regenerative? Because if you have a certification system that's labeled regenerative that allows farmers to use large amounts of glyphosate, for example, then I wouldn't consider that actually regenerative. I would say that, okay, you've polluted the term and we need a different term to define it, soil health building farming or something. My preference would be to see regenerative farming because it's a wonderful word. And it carries a whole lot of meaning if we then put the meaning behind it and carry that forward into practices. And so I think in terms of building certifications, I think there's a lot of care that needs to go into how they're actually being done so that they have the meaning that we would like to see associated with that term.
Thank you. Anne, anything to add to that question?
I think the only thing I would add is that when it comes to these, Dave has mentioned these kind of 3 to 4 basic practices: minimal physical and chemical disturbance, a diversity of crops, both your cover crops and your main crop that you're growing, and where it works and where a producer wants to, the integration of animals, again, because the animals are part of the nutrient cycling. And so these are these 4 broad principles, and they look very different depending on a farm setting. Like in Idaho, the winters are very cold, okay? So those practices are going to look different in Idaho than they do, say, down in Central or Southern California somewhere. And that what we really need to focus on, I think, is how do we get these 4 principles, on a regional level? What does that look like in Alabama, in Idaho, in Connecticut, in California, so that people don't get locked into some of the problems with the organic certification, which is a long list of don'ts. Don't do this or this or this or this. What I think regenerative could become, again, if people are realizing that the whole point of all of this is to improve soil health. And if you're spraying a bunch of glyphosate and doing no-till, you're not ever going to get to better, you'll reach slightly better soil health than when you were tilling, but that standard is in the gutter. If you're doing a lot of routine tillage and a lot of glyphosate, it would almost be impossible to not improve somewhat if you're going to reduce your tillage. So let's talk about it in terms of there's these 4 core practices. What does that look like given the local environmental setting of these different farms? And this is where I'm excited because farmers know their farms pretty darn well. And if you talk to them and give them a peer network to work with also within that region, so that they can have discussions like, yeah, my rye cover crop, that was terrible for me. What about you? Oh, I used this other thing and it worked very well. Then what you're doing is you're tailoring these principles to the specific practices that then support soil health and get, regenerative really growing and happening in all the different regions of the country.
Amazing. Thank you. And with that, we're a few minutes past 6 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap up there. I don't think we have any other questions from participants. Anne and David, thank you again both so much for your time and your expertise, and passion for continuing to have these conversations with people. If you are curious and would like to read their book, it will be available at the community library in Ketchum tomorrow when I return it. Thank you all for joining, and I hope that everyone learned something new today.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you.